My name is Mike Massey, and I am a senior practice manager at CADD Microsystems. Um, I've got about 30 plus years. I'm kind of aging myself by saying that, but I got 30 years experience in the AEC industry. I actually started as an architect, got a degree in architecture from Texas A&M University. From there, I went on to work with several resellers and became an expert at MEP. When I did that, I was asked to learn the MEP products, and for about 15 years straight, I did pretty much nothing but MEP as far as implementing MEP for both designers and contractors. Went on to work for a company that we did BIM services for, where I not only managed, but I managed projects for contractors using electrical primarily. So electrical is my love. I love electrical projects. I love Revit electrical, and I'm excited that Autodesk is finally giving us some new tools. Something like Jason said in his presentation, it seems like sometimes it's kind of skimpy on MEP new tools that are there. But this release, there are some new tools, and I'm excited to showcase one of them today. Like Dana said, this is a presentation that I did at Autodesk University. I'm going to condense it down a little bit for you so we can fit it in today, but I think you'll be able to understand. So what I'm focusing on today are the new tools for electrical analysis. These are preliminary tools that are in Revit 2023. And I've divided this up into four different sections to kind of break it down, but I think it will show you a typical workflow that you can use to begin using these tools. The first section that I'll talk about is define, where you can go in and start defining the electrical analytical load type settings. And so there's some new settings in Revit that I'll show you that we can set up to get our projects ready for this analysis. And this is the first step in there, is to set up these electrical load type settings. Once we have those settings defined in there, then we can get into the create section where we can actually start creating electrical analytical loads. And we can either do this one of two ways. We can either use what's called an area-based load. An area-based load will allow us to define an area in our plans, and it will multiply the square footage of that area by a power density that we set up in our load type settings, and it will give us a load for that area. Another type of load that we can create in Revit 2023 is an equipment load. And this would be for something that's outside of the area-based load, something like maybe for elevators or for major equipment that's in the building, that we can go ahead and just assign loads for that major equipment that's not based on a square footage in there. So I'll show you how we can create both the area-based loads and the equipment loads in there. Once we have those created, the next part is to apply, where we can come in and apply these loads to a conceptual distribution system. And this is another new feature inside of Revit 2023, being able to create a conceptual distribution system. This is going to be using the system browser that's built into Revit, but they've got some new tools in there that we can start defining our electrical loads prior to placing any families in our project. We could do this in previous releases, but we would have to have families in our projects first. But now we can do it preliminary before we start putting families into our project, so we can get some estimates in there at an early stage of the game. And finally, the last step would be to document. Once we have all this created, we can document this information either with tags and or schedules. And I'll show you how we can use that to document the process. So if we jump into the first section, define, again, this is where we're going to define some settings, and these are going to be the electrical analytical load type settings. And so these are going to be used with those area-based settings. And so when area-based loads. So when we start creating those area-based loads, it's going to use these settings to figure out the loads for it. But first of all, let me just kind of talk about what's new. So we got these new tools in Revit, which is great. We can do this now before placing any families inside of Revit. But let me just say this: electrical designers are probably going through this process today. but they're just doing it outside of Revit. They're using Excel or other programs that are outside of Revit. But it's great now that we can now bring it back into Revit and use the Revit model as the basis for these preliminary analysis loads. And so that's what's new. And again, we can create either an area-based load or equipment load, and we're also able now to create the distribution system. I will mention that these new tools, they work with a Revit model. You can also use a Revit linked-in architectural model to help you define the areas in there. So that's what I'll be doing, is using a linked-in architectural model. But it can also be done with a DWG or a PDF format. The workflow would be exactly the same. So if you do just have a PDF or a DWG, we can bring that into Revit and use that as our background and go through the same process. And currently, this is the first release of these tools. So hopefully that means that there will be improvements in future releases, but currently it only supports three-phase systems in there. So that is a limitation to these tools. But as far as defining those electrical load type settings, there's a new set of settings under the Manage tab. If you go up to the Manage tab and use the MEP settings dropdown, you'll see a new set of settings called Electrical Analytical Load Type Settings. And if you go into here, there'll be a couple of load type settings there by default, and you're free to use those if you want to, but we also have the ability to create new ones, duplicate them, rename them, delete them, whatever we want to do as far as creating other load type settings. And I would recommend creating a load type setting for each type of space that you have. So depending on your project, depending on what type of building it is, you may have common areas, or you may have resident areas, or you may have office areas, or you may have different types of areas in your building that will require different electrical loads. And for each one of these, we can create and assign the power density for that type of space. We can assign the load classification, the power factor, and the parent power density for each one of those. And so we can set this up. And once we have all these set up and created, we'll then start assigning these to those area-based loads that we're going to be creating in there. So that's the first step, is to define those electrical load type settings. The next step is to go ahead and create your analytical loads. And again, there's two ways we can do this. We can either use an area-based load or the equipment loads. For the area-based loads, we'll be using the plan as the guts of defining those areas. And once we have those areas defined, we'll create the area-based loads from that. And then the last step is to, once we have the area-based loads created and the equipment loads, we'll go back and we'll assign those loads to a power source, either to a panel or to something as far as where that load's coming from. But before we can do that, we'll first have to create that distribution system, so we have some panels to connect these loads to. But we'll go back and do that after we have that distribution system created. So as far as creating an area-based load, in there is really three steps to create an area-based load. We first have to create a boundary, a load boundary, and we'll use a new tool inside of Revit called Load Boundary to create that. Essentially, it's just a closed-in area, a closed-in line that defines the boundary. Once we have that closed-in boundary created, then we'll come back and actually create the load from that boundary. And then once we have the load created, we're free to come back in and subdivide that load if we need to. So we could create one overall load for the entire building and then start subdividing that into separate loads inside that overall load. So to create the area boundary, like I said, there is a new tool called Area Boundary, area-based load boundary. I'm getting my words mixed up. There's too many B's in that tool. But essentially, once we start that, it does go into what's called a sketch mode. And we can use our typical Revit sketching tools to trace out or define the boundary. The boundary does need to be a completely closed-in loop with no bad corners or anything like that. But we can use our modifying commands as far as align and trim and things like that to trim it out to create our boundary. My wish is that hopefully one day in the future, they'll be able to use maybe spaces to help us define these boundaries. But right now, it does not do that. We have to completely draw the boundary every time. It's kind of like in AutoCAD, we can use the hatch command and it finds the boundary for you. But in Revit, when we use the field region command, we have to define the boundary. Same thing here. We have to define that boundary as far as what it is. We do have a couple tools in here to help us to make sure that we don't have closed open ends or bad intersections or anything like that. We can show open ends to help us find, where we have open ends to clean that up. And we can also define, there's a specific new line style inside of Revit that we can assign these boundary lines to be on. So if we want to change the graphics of the lines, we can do that as well. Once we have that boundary created, then we'll move on to the area-based load command, where we actually will create the area load. And we simply do that by starting the command, and we'll get a contextual menu that pops up that allows us to either add a load area or remove a load area. So we can add and remove to this, but we just simply add pick the boundary that we want to add to the load, and it creates the load for us based off the square footage. Once we have the area created, then in the properties, we can go in and start assigning the load type to it. So going back to those settings that we set up on the first step, we'll assign one of those load types to this area so it knows what power density it's going to use to multiply and get the load. So we'll assign that. We can also give this area a name. So maybe it's a location like first floor, northwest resident area, whatever it is. We can assign a name to it. And if we already have a panel in our distribution system, we can go ahead and assign that supply from parameter as well. But if we don't, we'll come back and do that once we get that done. Once we create the load, we can also divide the load, like I said. So if we create one general area load for the entire floor, we can come back in and pick on that load and use some divide tools to divide that out and create sub areas inside of that. So maybe we have an area of that floor that's a mechanical room that has a different power density. We can simply just divide that out and create that mechanical room and assign that to be use a different load type setting. I do recommend the use of filters when you do this, because without filters, all these areas will look exactly the same. And so filters will allow us to create color codes so we can kind of visually tell, which area is where in our plans. So I recommend creating a filter for each type of load that you have in there. So if you have, a common area load and equipment area load, create a filter for each one of those. And then we can apply those filters to our view templates or our views and assign colors to those so that we can graphically tell in our plans, which areas are where in there. Otherwise, they're all going to look the same. And then the last step is the next step is to apply. And this is where we'll create that conceptual distribution system. And again, like I said, this is going to use the system browser. So if you're not familiar with the system browser in itself is not a new tool. It's been around for many years, but they've added a new part to the system browser. So at the top of the system browser, there's going to be a drop down that you can change and tell it that we want to view the analytical power distribution. And when we do, we'll start seeing the new tools in there that we can use to create this distribution system. And to create it, what we have are essentially 5 new buttons at the top of the system browser that we can use to create either a power source, which would be like a utility source or a generator. We have a tool to create an analytical bus that would represent a panel or a switchboard or a busway, et cetera. And we have a tool to create a transformer, a tool to create a transfer switch. And the transfer switch is unique because it actually has 2 power sources. And then we also have the electrical equipment load that we can use to just create the electrical equipment load for things like elevators and major equipment that we have in our building. So we essentially just build this out. We start picking on these buttons, and it's almost like building an Excel spreadsheet where we can pick on the button and it will create the load for us, and we can adjust them and tell it what it's connected to. And then once we kind of have it built out, then we can go back and start assigning those area-based loads to the equipment, to the power source. So initially, when you first create all the area-based loads, they're not going to be connected to anything. So they're all going to be grouped under the unconnected folder at the top of the system browser. But as we start connecting those and assigning the power source, they will move underneath that power source. And when we do, you can see that the loads add up. And so if we have a panel that has 3 different areas inside that panel, it's going to add those loads up for the panel and give us a total estimated panel load in there as well for that. As far as the equipment load, if we do have equipment in there, we can just add the equipment, and on the equipment, once we add it, we'll switch back over to the properties. And on the properties, it's not using a square footage or anything to calculate the load on that. We just simply assign the load to it. So we can assign, the load classifications, the voltage, the power factor, the parent load. We can also tell it, which panel it's coming from as well in there. But, that's just kind of like a standalone piece of equipment that we've come in and assigned the load for that separately from everything else. So I do want to switch over. I do have Revit open and a sample project open that we can jump into. This one is completed, but I did want to show you that system browser. So if I open up my system browser in here, this is already all hooked up in here. But if I start expanding this out, what I've got in here is a generator for this project, but I've got, as far as my service coming from my utility, I've got a main switchboard for the campus, and then I've got a transfer switch, and then a main switchboard, and then I got all my panels in there. And each one of these panels, I've assigned those area-based loads to it. So I've come in and I created the area-based loads, and I told it which power source it's using, and it's doing the math for me as far as calculating the square footage of that area, multiplying it by the power density to give me an estimated load over here. And then, like I said, it's summing all this up and connecting it up to the panel, giving me a total panel load, and it's coming up, and we can get very quickly in here a load up here. If we go up to the utility, we can see all the loads added up for you together in there as far as that total building load. And so again, this is something that we could do in previous releases, but we would have to have all these panels in our project. I don't have a single panel in this project. This is all analysis, all analytical. And so this, another wish list item on my list is, now that we have this analytical distribution system created, can I now go back and just put in panels and it will read my distribution system and automatically map it out to my analytical distribution system? Can't do that yet, but maybe one day.
Almost like future, a placeholder.
It might be able to do that. Yeah. But for now, we would have to manually come in there and put our panels in there to match our distribution system. All right, let me jump back to my PowerPoint real quick. And then the last step I've got in here is just, I want to talk about how we can document these loads. So we can either use tagging to document them. So we can either tag, the area-based loads in our plan, something similar to what we have on the screen here. There is a new category inside of Revit for these tags. It is an area-based load tag. So if you do create a tag from scratch, that is the category that you're going to assign the tag to use in there. But there's, just like any tag, we can use different parameters or pick and choose which parameters we want to use for that tag. In this case, I've got the actual name of the area load in there. I've got the power density, I've got the square footage, I've got the total load, and also the panel source as far as which panel these loads are connected to. So again, a lot of information can be included in just tagging a floor plan. And then also we can create schedules. There's actually 5 different schedules that they've added to the Revit scheduling command. We can create a schedule for just the overall loads, and that's the main schedule that you see here on the screen, just calling out all of my spaces that I've got in there, and where it's being supplied from, the power density, the area, the parent load, and calculating and summing all that up for me for each level of the building. But you could also create just a analytical bus schedule, or a power source schedule, or a transfer schedule, or a transformer schedule. So those are the new types of schedules that they've added in there. But again, it's reading all this from that analytical distribution system and calculating that for you. So again, it's pretty exciting. I like it. It's new. It's going to require a change as far as the process that electrical designers are using today, moving them away from Excel back into Revit. But I think it's a step in the right direction to get them to do that. So again, wrapping it up, I'll just say that you can define, create, apply, and document would be the steps that I would follow if you want to start practicing this.
I actually grabbed a screenshot of this and threw it on the mural because it's such a great little overview of the process. So thank you so much, Mike. That was a wonderful presentation and overview. Seems like there's a common theme here that there's a bunch of new features. It's going to be different, but it's totally going to benefit you in so many ways. So don't be scared. Get over that hump. In addition to the page that you just saw with Mike's information, we of course have it on the mural. So thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much to our presenters. It is the top of the hour.